Hi, y'all. Thanks for coming to my talk. This is how I learned to stop worrying and build a modern detection and response program. Today, we're going to use a framework I built to create a modern detection and response program. Y'all will come away from this talk with a better understanding of what a modern program should look like, how all the tools, capabilities, and processes should fit together, and how to build and evaluate so you can stop crying every time your pager alerts blow up your phone. But first, hi, I'm Allyn. I'm a senior staff engineer at Airbnb on our technology leadership team, where I work on non-stressful things like threat detection and incident response. I'm also a dad, and I live in Austin, Texas with my wife and 2-year-old son, Liam. Here we are in a giant adult-sized ball pit where I almost lost him so many times, maybe he's still there. And this talk is, in a way, inspired by Liam. You see, I'm a worrier. And being a parent and a worrier and an incident response is a super fun combo. I remember when Liam was just a few hours old, he was sleeping in the hospital bassinet, and I was listening to him breathe, when I noticed that his breathing sounded a little different. And I started to worry. So I got up to look at him, and he's purple. Now, I've been a dad for about 30 minutes, and if you've ever seen a newborn baby, they're purple. But he's very purple. And as I'm taking a closer look, I can see that he's struggling to breathe. But I know what to do. I have a plan. I paid attention during that online parenting class I took during COVID, and I flip him over in my hand, pat him on the back, and he spits up, and he starts crying. But he's breathing again. He's fine. And Liam gifted me something really important that day, and that was perspective on my worrying. And I realized something. Worrying can be a superpower. There's a research paper out of the University of California, Riverside called The Surprising Upsides of Worry. And in this paper, they argue that while worrying, especially at extreme levels, certainly has its negative outcomes, but there's a really cool upside to worry. Here's a quote from the paper. Worry illuminates the importance of taking action to prevent an undesirable outcome and keeps the situation at the front of one's mind to ensure that appropriate action is taken. On Blue Team, worrying is a constant reminder that things can and will go wrong. But without a plan or strategy, we'll keep worrying. And here's where I see a lot of programs fail. Now, I started my career on the red team, and I got to watch Blue Team fail a lot. And when I switched over to the Blue Team, because I thought I could do it so much better, and started working in detection and response, I found that myself and my teammates, while we were experts at accomplishing the technical work, we really didn't have a vision or strategy for what we were building. And I believe this is one of the major reasons Blue Teams fail. We are taking lots of action, we're really busy, but we're really making it up as we go, or just copying what we did at our last organization because it kind of worked there. So after making lots of mistakes, I took all of these lessons learned and built a framework that finally worked for me, and hopefully it'll help you build a much better detection and response program. And this way y'all can learn from my mistakes and make better, more informed mistakes than I did. But before we dive in, let's talk about what I mean when I say a modern detection and response program versus a legacy one. A legacy program is reactive, where the focus is on alerts that indicate that something bad has already happened. A legacy program focuses all of its strategy on the technology. You know you're doing this when you describe your program by listing all the tools you own and the vendors you do business with without thinking about the capabilities that you actually have. A legacy program has a lot of manual heavy tasks. Sure, you may have invested in automation tooling, but if your teams are still doing a lot of the day-to-day tasks manually, you're still operating in this legacy model. And finally, a legacy program operates completely siloed and disjointed from the rest of the organization. I'm most guilty of this one. But it puts your teams completely out of touch with your org's technology. It inhibits their ability to work side by side with partner teams, and you end up trying to solve problems that would be better solved in collaboration with other teams. On the other hand, a modern program is proactive, and that doesn't just mean you're doing a thing called threat hunting. It means your philosophy for detection incorporates the idea that you want to detect a threat as early in an attack as possible, and that there's many signals you can correlate before that something bad has happened, alert needs to fire. And instead of being so tool-focused, a modern program builds strategy that is business-focused, gross. But by that I mean that we empower our teams with more than requirements, but also the context of what they're working on and how it empowers the business to succeed. A modern program prioritizes automation. When you're implementing processes, integrating tools, your first thought should be, how will we automate this, instead of creating those manual playbooks that you sure hope you'll automate in the future. You won't. A modern program is connected to the business. It centralizes its functions, workflows, and data, because you can't succeed by trying to do this on your own. You won't be able to scale. And that all sounds great, but what about all the challenges in my way? And I know them very well. It's the alert fatigue that's grinding any sense of hope to move forward. It's your lack of a budget to get the tools you need to succeed. Hiring, retaining talent is especially difficult because these roles lead to burnout, and it seems like you'll never get out of firefighting mode as the incidents, they just keep coming. Well, hopefully I'm here to help. And to help us get past this, we're going to use the process of organizational design. So I read the book, so you didn't have to. And this book lays out a step-by-step process for designing your organization. Now, they have 7 steps, but I know my audience. And the talk after mine is lunch. So we have 4 steps, since most of you haven't had enough coffee for 7 steps. And these are the 4 phases of the framework we're going to work through today. We're going to assess and analyze our current state. We're going to design and develop our ideal program. We'll talk about when it comes time to implement, how we can overcome some of those operational challenges. And finally, we'll evaluate and report. And I'll talk about how we all suck at metrics. So here we go. We start by asking, where are we and what do we have? Do you have anything? Maybe you have a large program that reports detailed metrics, and maybe it's you and some antivirus, maybe. We want to understand our starting point, and the first piece of advice I want to give here is to stop doing and start learning. Take a breath. Sure, things might be on fire, but they've been on fire for some time. So before we start fixing, we need to first learn. And we're going to learn from these 3 different viewpoints. And first up is our vision and mission. And instead of reading what I'm sure is a riveting vision and mission statement, I want you to ask, what is unique about detection and response at your organization? What unique problems does the culture, the technology, and the people at your organization pose for detection and response? And then what are people spending their time doing? Asking these questions will help us figure out what the organization needs from a detection and response program. So who do we ask? Audience participation. Regulators. They're good people to ask. Who else? Huh? Business, the business, yeah. We want to ask the people that are on the team that are actually going to try to build this, right? My favorite's legal. You always want to bring legal in first. You want to talk to your partner teams, not just the detection and response team, but the red team, your corporate, your production security teams, third-party risk. And here's a silly question. How do we ask? Nicely, hopefully. So questionnaires are not a tool I've often used, but some of these questions take time for people to think about, hence the very slow reaction I'm getting here. So a questionnaire might be appropriate. And then we can assess our viewpoint from our people and understand the skill sets we have before we start building. And the resource I'll point you to for assessing people is NICE Cybersecurity Workforce Framework. It comes from NIST, and it categorizes and describes different cybersecurity skills. In NICE, skills are defined as work roles. There's a lot of them, but to give you a jump start, I've taken these work roles and grouped them into detection and response roles. These are very general groupings, and I'd expect you to have responders that are also engineers, but I found that these roles make it easier to talk about the skills needed without too much customization. And then to assess, back when I was a senior manager, I created a self-evaluation survey. I asked my team to rate themselves for each of the work groups. So for forensic analyst, each member of my team would rate themselves as either having no experience, small baby amount, all the way up to parallel parking during rush hour. And then we can all use that data to create a heat map that visualizes the experiences and skill sets of the team. So now you have an estimate of what skills you have, where you have strengths and weaknesses, and where you have gaps. And this can help you evaluate technology decisions, the tools you're building, where to prioritize mentorship, and where to target training and hiring. And then next, we look at our technology. And for these, I'd like you to consider that technical capabilities are not product categories. And by that, I mean you might have something called EDR, and I might have something called EDR, but depending on the vendor, the tool, the operating systems, which license subscription we have, if we can figure that out, and what we're actually using, our capabilities might be really different. And second, I think product categories are confusing. I think if I surveyed 3 people in this room what XDR was, I'd probably get 4 different answers. So we're analyzing and designing our technical architecture. So we're going to focus on technical capabilities instead of product categories. All right, cool. You did great. You stopped and learned. Now we're going to have some fun and design our detection and response program. And when I design and develop, I like to think about it like I'm telling a story. Because stories are memorable. Our brains are wired to remember stories. You might walk away from this talk only remembering the story I told at the beginning. This is Liam again. He's 2 now. He can't read, surprise. But he can recite this book about Leo going for a swim word for word. So having a vision or a mission statement or whatever you write down is cool, I guess. But when you start to talk about your program like you're telling a story, that's when it can really start to resonate. So with that in mind, let's start designing and developing. And in this phase, we're going to create these 2 views. For the first, we're going to ask ourselves, what processes does our program need? Processes tell the story of what we do. And to better enable this storytelling, we're going to build a process view. And this is a diagram that gives a visual representation of how the processes in our program interact with each other. And I'm an engineer now, so I have bad news. The diagram I'm about to show you is not an exact diagram. It's not intended to be. It's a visual that's going to help us tell our story. So I'll start from an ideal beginning, where our first process is threat modeling, where we build profiles of threat actors, gather intrusion sets to understand what type of threats do we care about the most. And the story I'm telling here is this program is fueled by threat intel, where intel, both internal and external, is collected, analyzed, and disseminated throughout the program, whether that's in the form of threat briefings, IOCs, hunt packages. The story I'm telling here is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We still need the classics: event monitoring, triage, analysis, incident response, and forensics. The story I'm telling here is that we're proactive. Our intel, often from incidents, is used for threat hunting, maybe starting with simple IOC searching and then moving into more creative data analysis. And the story I'm telling here is that we continuously test and improve our program using something that I like to call micro-purple tests, tests that simulate threat techniques so you can validate that your detections actually work and that people actually know how to respond to those. The analogy I like to use is that when you write some code, you write some tests, right? Liars. You write a detection, you should write a test to validate that, yes, that detection actually detects what you think it does. And we use the results of those tests to prioritize the continuous improvement of our detections and responses to threats. including findings from threat huntings, like gaps we might find in specific logs. The story I'm telling here is that observability, which I'll talk about in a bit, is the foundation for engineering detections and enables threat hunting to provide its inputs. And when our detections fire, our classical operational processes can pick up the event and start the triage and response processes. And the story I'm telling here is that this program's performance can be measured and that data is communicated about how we're succeeding, improving, changing our strategy, and investing. So then we can circle right back to the beginning where our incident data flows back into our threat intel collection so we can continue to inform the program with new threat hunts, threat briefings, and detections. And if we zoom out, we can see that our reporting and metrics can also inform our red teams with new scenarios, our security awareness teams with metrics from phishing events so we can better educate our users, and our partner security teams that build and operate many of the controls that help prevent incidents from ever occurring. Cool, now we've got some processes. Let's look at building our architecture. And we're not gonna list product categories. We care about capabilities. And we started with the process view because I think it's easier to think about what we need to do and then think about the technical capabilities we need to do those. And so here I'll give you some resources for when you want to think about capabilities. MITRE ATT&CK, you're familiar with it, knowledge base of attacker tactics and techniques. One way I've used attack is to walk through the tactics and think, what capabilities do I need to detect and respond to this? And then think about that in all of my different environments. MITRE DEFEND, not released too long ago, it's a catalog of defensive techniques that are mapped to attack. Defend can be a little bit prescriptive, but I think it really shines when it describes analysis techniques. Tines have a SOC automation matrix, which lists all the common activities most SOCs want to automate. It's a really good starting point, and it covers all the things you'd expect, like enrichment and user interaction. But it also covers things that you might want to automate that maybe you don't think about, like documentation, because I'm sure you're all great at documentation. And then finally, there's Snowflake's detection series on Medium, which connects building detections to software engineering. And I've also spent some time thinking about how to measure detection and response capabilities using a maturity model approach. Maturity models are a fun way to think about the goal state of a program. Notice I didn't say end state. This work never ends. But this model is still in progress and hopefully a future talk, but I wanted to briefly share where it's at today. And in thinking about detection and response, I've broken this maturity model down into 3 pillars. The first, observability. It's the foundation that we build our detection and response capabilities. It's having the tools and logs that give us visibility into our environments and infrastructure, along with the context and intelligence that an analyst needs to determine next steps. Second is proactive threat detection, where we're constantly looking for threats and doing everything possible to be prepared for those attack scenarios. And then finally, we have rapid response, because we want to be able to stop and contain threats quick. And for each of these pillars, there's a few key functions. So for observability, we care about entity coverage or visibility into resources. These are things like your logs for users, systems, devices, platforms, apps. And then activity coverage is any action or state change for those entities. Searchability, which is simply the ease and speed of answering questions. So collecting, aggregating, optimizing, and normalizing entity and activity data. But not stopping at searchability, but also contextualization, or understanding what an event means and what's relevant about it in the timeline of all the involved entities. I say this as someone who has been a SOC analyst for many years. Capabilities like correlation, enrichment, and historical context usually fall into this function. And then you have the data and platform sources you need to enable this enrichment, things like your asset inventory, I hope you have that, identity management, and IP address and DNS information. For proactive threat detection, you'll see I yet again start with threat intel with the intelligence sourcing function. This could be collecting external threat intel, doing threat modeling exercises on a production app, findings from your threat hunting, and the data you've reported in your incident and metrics. Detection coverage measures your ability to detect threats informed by intelligence, while often measuring your gaps from whitelisting, exceptions, blind spots, or missing logs, or just a lack of baseline information. And then there's my favorite trio, efficacy, or the likelihood that an alert is a true or false positive based on a subset of your historical data. Effectiveness, which simply asks, has this alert ever fired for actual malicious activity? And then efficiency, measuring how long it takes to trigger and investigate an alert. And then finally, accuracy, which measures whether a detection has the appropriate precision and sensitivity values for the risk. Have you undertuned, doubt it, or overtuned your detections? Is the volume of your program's false positive to true positive ratio appropriate to the associated risks? And then for rapid response, do you have the playbooks, enrichments, and automations for detections and known incident types? Not only testing these scenarios with the security team, but also across the organization. Good keynote today talking about how we need to do better about going to all of the different departments in our organization. Because you might have the right technical capability to isolate hosts, but if isolating that host brings down production, you might want to rethink your approach. I know this. And involve all the right stakeholders in finding the right technical solution for an incident. And hopefully you do it before the incident. And all that pre-work is so you can measure and improve your overall incident response performance. And how quickly did you arrive at the incident, determine the facts, and mitigate the incident? Did the response team correctly interpret the data and make productive decisions? And did you miss anything? So let's think now a little bit more specifically about the capabilities you'll need by going back to our process view. And if we focus on threat intel and think about the types of data we'd like to be collecting, about threat actors, intrusions, things from the app formerly known as Twitter, but also actionable intel like early warning signals, dark web postings related to your organization, threats to your brand and reputation, creds for sale. And then we have to think about how we're going to collect it, disseminate it, and integrate it across all our tooling for intel-driven detection. And then switching over to our classic processes, thinking about all the automated capabilities we'll need to do triage and analysis, as well as automate our response. And then for my more engineering-focused and proactive processes, I think about not just collecting the logs, but doing everything I need to do to get observability out of my logs, thinking about how I need analytics to detect threat behaviors and malware across all of my entities, and then how to automate testing of all the MITRE ATT&CK techniques or other techniques you come up with in all my different environments. And then we can put all those capabilities together and create our architecture view. And just as I discussed before, the headline for this story is that we're taking all of our threat intel capabilities to enable intel-driven detection so that our threat behavior, our malware analytics, and micro-purple tests can be directly informed by our intel. Take all that data, turn it into something our teams can use for true observability, and engineer detections that generate alerts for automated analysis to trigger rapid responses across all our various controls. So now we've got a long-term architecture for us to work on to deliver a modern program. And sure, that sounds great. Beautifully drawn processes, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. But what about the fact that I have a lack of a budget for tools? I don't have any new headcount. So let's talk about that. So first, let's talk about making the most of the people that you do have. So when I transitioned from being an engineer to a manager, my perspective really changed. I had to take a step back and think about the bigger picture, and the idea of building these views came to my mind. And now I'm in an engineering role, and I realize that these viewpoints are vital for everyone, but almost most importantly, the people that are building this. The stories we're telling our people about what they're building and what's the most important thing to be working on are really hard to convey sometimes. And so having a visual, especially for people that are visual learners or just want to organize things, it can really help. And this is really important for operational teams, especially because we are always feeling like we're pulled in many different directions. If you're trying to build a new program, but you have a lot of historical debt, noisy alerts, manual tasks, I have found two approaches that work really well. The first is to declare bankruptcy. You're not going to solve yourself out of this one. I gave a similar version of this talk elsewhere, and somebody asked me a very detailed question about how they were very stuck in the mud and could only see making micro steps. And in those cases, I think a lot of times declaring bankruptcy is not a bad approach. Saying, you know what, we're going to just push this to the side and start anew. It probably won't completely fly with your leadership. And so you may want to think about how you can outsource the most critical things possible that need to keep running right now, time box it, hire a third-party SOC or something, throw bodies at the problem so that you and your team can focus on starting to build something that works. And then as you prioritize your technical capabilities, the inevitable question about the approach of building versus buying, and I'm an engineer, so I love to build, but I usually recommend that solutions that give you 65% of the way there, not ignoring the basic principles. So you still want to be proactive. You still want to prioritize automation. Those still need to hold true. So whatever technologies you're bringing in need to still enable that. But if you can buy solutions that get you the 65% of the way there, then your team can focus on building those program specifics. And of course, while you build, you've still got incidents, you've still got operations. Those are still going to blow up your phone. But especially in the beginning of implementation, try to push back and let the less critical things fall on the floor. Because we do a really good job of giving the appearance that our busyness means that the program is working just fine. And as we'll discuss next, changing what and how you report can open your leadership's eyes to the reality and then get them on board with this new endeavor to shift to a modern program. So let's jump into it. And just like there was legacy in modern programs, I think some of you with very modern programs may still be falling into very legacy methods of evaluating and reporting, and it's preventing you from getting the support, the funding, or the ability to shift to this more modern approach. And when I say legacy, it means you're still thinking reactive by assuming that time to detect, time to respond, and time to contain is all there is to say about incidents. When I say legacy, it's a report to leadership with the number of events that happened last month in comparison to this month, without any context, as if it provided any meaning to anybody. And I know every single one of you have been in a program that has done just this, or inherited those metrics. It's a report of what you're seeing without any context of what you know you aren't seeing. And overall, legacy reporting doesn't tell the business doesn't tell the business what the value of your program. All they know is that some bad stuff happened. There was more bad things this month than last month, and you are very busy. While a modern program provides context around the detections in place, describing how threats are being detected and what the impact to business is. Our reporting should focus on what threats we're seeing, can see, are seeking funding to see. It provides context to your numbers. What are the associated threats? What environments could be impacted, and where is their visibility? And it quantifies those to business risk. Like, hey, remember that ransomware incident we had? That could have meant we weren't doing business for weeks, and that's a lower estimate. So I want to talk briefly about 4 ways to evaluate and report. I've talked a lot about observability, and I think these 3 questions really simplify what I'm getting at. What can we detect today? What threats can we see? What can't we see? What's our landscape coverage? Do I have the same threat visibility in my cloud platform that I have on my laptops? And then take both of those and answer, what's our overall visibility into threats? And to answer what we can detect today, I mentioned the idea of micropurple testing. That is building a repository of threat techniques. I like to start with MITRE ATT&CK, defining the scope and complexity of the test, and then running attack simulations, or what we're calling these micropurple tests, and then scoring how effective we are at detecting and responding to that attack activity. This validates whether we can or can't detect something, so we know what to develop and improve on. And here's an example of what running all the techniques across MITRE ATT&CK on our endpoints and scoring them as pass or fail might look like. In this hypothetical example, the story is that we've got good coverage on discovery and techniques, say C2 techniques, but the attacker might be able to move laterally through the network without being detected. And that could be bad for business if you have poor controls between environment boundaries, because none of you have a flat network, right? Next, we look at the results of running all those techniques across all our different environments, or what I'm calling landscapes. We get a different view of where tactics might be less likely to be discovered. So here, the story is that this organization has pretty good endpoint coverage, but almost no visibility into their containers, which is a problem because that's where the business apps run. And then you can sum it up by providing overall visibility by looking at the results of your micropurple tests, looking at the detections you have in place today, but maybe you haven't written tests for those yet to validate, and then weighting those by the priority and prevalence of your environment. And then you can use these 3 reports to tell leadership what are the different types of threats, which ones we can see and where, and overall how we're doing. And then, of course, you could trend this over time. And closely tied to our observability report are our metrics. And for these, please, let's move away from giving alert numbers and instead say, we know what we can see. What threats are we seeing the most and where? Which ones pose the biggest threats to the business? From what we can see, what are the trends and impact? What preventative controls, investments could reduce this risk and impact? So instead of giving a lot of meaningless numbers, derive from your events. What are the top threats? What are your top landscapes or environments at risk? And what are the top incident trends that the business need to immediately address? And speaking of incidents, a valuable tool for evaluating reporting is using your incidents as a narrative to describe how well the program is or isn't working. Which process surfaced each incident? How did our response process perform? Did a technical capability catch this threat? And did we expect it to be caught sooner? And which tool was it? What did we have to do manually versus automatically, and what investments would make it better? And we can think about this from our people roles as well. Did we have the skills we needed to respond? And with all those, then we can present our roadmap. We know what we can and can't detect. We know what type of threats are impacting the business, and we know where we can make it better. So then you can create your roadmap and make your asks. And here's where micropurple testing can really pay off. It gives you the data to support what capabilities you need to reduce the risk of threats to the business, but it also helps you prioritize. So the results of your testing allows you to score where you're effective and where you're not. And then taking the input from your incidents, your SOC tickets, and threat hunts to prioritize based on risk, where you lack detections for threats impacting the business today, where you lack observability to detect those threats, and where you lack the automation to analyze and respond rapidly and effectively. And with your prioritized backlog, you can propose a roadmap and make data-driven requests to close those gaps with the necessary funding, headcount, whatever you need. So here we are. Instead of hiring based on the number of alerts or investigations, you can make data-driven decisions based on your roles and skill sets. Instead of threat hunting because it sounds cool, your process view is a story that answers what your program does, how it provides value, and how you measure success. Instead of buying because Gartner said so, you have a vision for your architecture with a prioritized timeline to accomplish it, with clear asks to leadership. Instead of telling your boss, I think we might be able to detect it, you have metrics that describe your threat coverage and performance from previous incidents. And now, hopefully, you've learned how to stop worrying and build a detection and response program. Thanks so much for having me. Real quick, here's my email, and my LinkedIn and Twitter handles are on my website. I write a very infrequent newsletter called Meoward. It has an adorable cat that people love, and the security info is pretty okay. So please subscribe. Also, please be sure to give your feedback in the Black Hat Events app. It will be under my evaluations later. And then it looks like we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. So I'll take questions now. I would ask to step up to the mic so I don't have to repeat it.
Hello. So one question, you mentioned it both in the metrics and in the narratives, that it is better to tell a story, better to tell explicit things than numbers. What if leadership actually asks for numbers?
So that's a tough one, because especially when you've been presenting the same metrics for a very long time, and you've been saying, this is how many events we have, this is how many events we've had, this is how many events we have. It's a little bit of a rip the Band-Aid off, and it's also a little bit of pushback to your leadership. I don't think if you keep providing the number of events that your SOC is triaging, it is actually effectively telling the story that you need to. You do have numbers with this approach. You have a percentage of the type of threats that you know you can cover. You know which type of threats you are seeing today, and you can speak to those numbers, and you could provide numbers behind what are the top threats that you're seeing and incidents. So you have numbers, but refuse to provide the same numbers.
Okay.
Or find a new company. All right, we got time for one more. I said you had to go up to the mic, so no one's going to do it. All right. Thanks, y'all. I appreciate it.